So, without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Taylor. She is one of our fabulous college counselors here at Great Expectations College Prep. And over the past decade, Taylor has worked as a humanities teacher, educational coach, and a university counselor. Her background in psychology and a master's in secondary education have fueled her passion for helping students. Taylor has guided students to top universities globally, using her expertise to create authentic applications and balanced university lists. So take it away, Taylor.
Yeah. Hi. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited to talk to you about what it's like to apply to college as a student with a learning difference or as the parent of a student with a learning difference. It is a little bit of a niche process. And so a lot of times when you're looking for information, it can be difficult to find the right steps. So let's start off with just kind of some basic terminology. So, learning differences is kind of like our big umbrella term. It can basically kind of cover anything that's related to, neurodiversity. It can also be specific to things like dyslexia, dysgraphia, visual spatial differences, anything that can basically impact learning or understanding. And so the way that I typically think about learning differences, neurodivergence, neurodiversity, kind of interchangeable terms depending on who you're talking to, is a lot of times it's like going through the world as a left-handed person in a right-handed world. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't thinking through things in the correct way, but it just kind of means a lot of times like the system wasn't made for you. And so this can make the process a little bit more difficult or a little bit more time consuming. So Students with learning differences might experience some of the following things: delayed response times, difficulty with written or auditory comprehension, a hard time with sequence or storytelling, struggling with focus, mental stamina, or paying attention, need additional time, find reading and writing challenging, avoiding certain tasks, struggle with memory or recalling, appearing disorganized, being impulsive, finding it difficult to read social cues, feeling anxious, depressed, nervous, or uncomfortable. This is actually really interesting. So, for a lot of women, in fact, who get diagnosed later in life, they get diagnosed with anxiety or depression long before they ever get diagnosed with a learning difference, because a lot of women have learned to mask so well their learning difference that it's only manifesting as anxiety or depression until they actually dig a little bit deeper and find that they have this learning difference going on. And this absolutely can happen to men as well, but it's just like a common trend we see. So struggling socially or having a hard time communicating, this is also very common. So when we talk about learning differences, it's not just school. It's not just academics. It's not just the things that we're struggling with, as a student, or students are struggling with them when they graduate and go into the workforce. It's also about their interpersonal connections, and that can also impact the way that their grades appear or the way that they go through school. Okay. So in the college admissions world, it is very different in high school than it is from college. So one of the things that I just want to acknowledge is that typically students with learning differences have a significantly lower rate of graduation than neurotypical students. It's usually about half. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the main reasons, like when looking at this, is that for students with learning differences, they often have a hard time with that transition from high school to college. There's typically a lot less support in the college process. And so finding ways to accommodate or make adjustments or adapt to that new change of environment can feel very overwhelming, especially in the first 6 months or the first year. And so having a lot of support at the beginning of college really does make the difference for most students between being able to graduate or feeling like it's too overwhelming and that they aren't going to be able to do this. So finding those accommodations early, and finding those advocacy skills early is incredibly important. The other thing that's really important for this is creating college lists that make sense for the students. So, universities that have a great track record of supporting students with learning differences. For some students, this means staying closer to home. For other students, this means finding tutors or other things that can support them in this process, or having friends or family members who have been through this process before that help to guide them or talk about what was beneficial for them when they went to college. Um, But that's why a college list is so important. We want it to be balanced. We want to make sure that the student is going to get all the support that they need when they have this potentially difficult transition period. So let's talk about laws and rights, because this is a really important aspect of getting what you need when you go to college if you have a learning difference. Um, so students cannot be denied from a college for having a learning difference. So they're protected. Or for having any type of neurodivergence. So once students are in college, though, they are no longer protected by IDEA, or Individuals with Disability Education Act, which protects students in high school. Students are protected by the ADA, by the federal civil rights laws once they're in college. And college students typically fall under the 504 section. So if you have an IEP or a 504 in high school, typically the 504 provides some accommodation, but it's not an individualized education plan. Right. So when students transition from high school to college, they typically cannot take their IEP with them. You may be able to ask for similar accommodations, but it will not be an IEP. It will fall under this 504 umbrella. Okay, so subpart D applies to K through 12, and subpart E applies to colleges. And this ensures that students with disability are granted equal access to academic programs and services. So this is about access. It's less about ensuring that the student has the highest possibility of success. So a lot of times IEPs are set up that way. You know, you go into that meeting, a gen ed teacher, a special education teacher, sometimes an administrator, you sit down with the family and the child, and you work out what are the best things we can do to help you be successful. But a 504 is more going to be along the lines of what gives you access to the information that your peers are getting in college, not necessarily what is going to be help you be most successful in this environment. So there's that distinction, which is part of the reason that this transition can be so difficult. So colleges have different laws than high school students. They're only required to offer appropriate academic accommodations or adjustments for students with documented learning disabilities and learning differences. So all students can access their education. So documentation is incredibly important. If you have a student who has their documentation and it hasn't been updated in a while, it really cannot be more than 3 years old when they're going to college. So I always advise parents in that junior year to update any documentation that you have, make sure that everything is up to date, review this with, you know, the psychiatrist or whoever your child works with for their learning difference or how they were diagnosed, to make sure that all of that is up to date as much as possible. Make sure that 504s and IEPs have as specific language as possible in them, because these are legal documents and they can be used to access accommodations in college. So they're not required to identify, diagnose, evaluate, or assess students for accommodations. Basically, they can change the requirements for majors, graduations, or credits. They aren't going to do any of that. Okay, so a lot of times if a student has an IEP and they're in my classroom, they may have a slightly modified task, or they may have some other things that make the task more accessible for them. But in university, it's unlikely that that will happen. Sometimes you do have individual professors who are willing to kind of like hear out the issue and work with the student on an individual basis, but this is not a requirement by the law. This is not protected. It's just really the professor being kind. Um, so colleges are not permitted to contact or involve parents without students' permission. So this is another thing that's quite different from high school. In high school, we're very used to, you know, parents being asked all the questions, involved in everything. But in college, basically the student is very much on their own unless they've, you know, through the process you've worked out that the school knows they have permission to contact you and your student is okay with that and you're all working together. Um, and students cannot be charged for basic accommodations that the school provides. And students must have an IEP or a 504 plan to get the accommodation. So that's why I'm saying that documentation is so, so, so important when asking for accommodations. In that junior year, please, please, please make sure that all of that stuff is up to date. Okay, so disclosing learning differences on the application. This is something that oftentimes parents have questions about because some people are biased. You know, you say that a student has a learning difference and all of a sudden they're making assumptions. The great thing about the college application process is that the majority of admissions counselors or admissions officers do have educational training. They're aware of learning differences, and many schools celebrate neurodiversity. They see this as something that's beneficial to their school. They want students who think differently, think creatively, have different ways of doing things, different ideas. They realize that that is a benefit to their educational community. Um, so they show perseverance, they show determination. These are great qualities that schools are looking for. Um, and this is something when I talk to parents, even from like my generation, I grew up in like the 90s, early 2000s. There was still a lot of discrimination against learning differences, and luckily a lot of that has dissipated. We still experience it at some level, or we still talk to people who have biases, but for the most part it's improved greatly. Um, so it's illegal to discriminate based on learning differences, um, but disclosing can actually help the chances of admission. And it can give context to the admissions committee, and it may help the office understand course selection and other aspects of the student's profile. So this is the best part about disclosing this, is that it gives context for why the student may have chosen certain courses, why certain things may appear on the transcript. And so this is when disclosing on the application is typically most beneficial, when it provides that additional context. Um, so it's typically highly encouraged to disclose if the high school student was enrolled in support classes that are reflected on their transcript. The student had some part of a graduation requirement waived, like a foreign language, due to a learning difference. Here in New York, we have the Regents. And so typically students who have an IEP are allowed to score slightly lower on the Regents and still pass it. And so that may show up on a student's transcript. And in that case, you would probably want to disclose. If grades were lower due to a learning difference, and then the student received accommodations or support and we saw their grades improve, that can definitely give some context, especially if this was earlier in their high school career. Um, and then if the explanation of class choice or less rigorous curriculum in high school will help the admissions committee understand the student's circumstances. So, a student with dyslexia, for example, may opt out of a very intensive AP literature course because they know that the reading requirement for that course would be extremely taxing on them. Right. So we do want to kind of give context, not necessarily as like an excuse, but yeah, it gives context for like why they may have opted out of certain courses. Okay. So how and where are we going to disclose this on the application? So a lot of times when I'm talking to students about their personal statement and they have a learning difference, it's something that they want to write about because a lot of times they're proud of the progress they've made. And it is something to be proud of. You've learned how to navigate this thing. You've made a lot of progress. You've shown your determination, your persistence, all of these things that we talked about that, universities want to see. Um, However, the personal statement usually isn't the best place to discuss learning difference because it's not what defines the student, right? It's a part of their story, but it isn't who they are. So sometimes if students really do want to kind of connect this and their learning difference or in their personal statement, a lot of times I try to set it up as it's kind of like in the background. We mention it briefly and then we move on, versus it being the focus of the story, because there's other places in the application where this makes more sense to disclose. So admissions counselors are reading tons and tons and tons of essays. And the topic of learning differences is something that's pretty common in the application admissions essay process or admissions essays. And so choosing something that's like a little bit more unique, that really highlights their character, their personality, their interest, those typically make for stronger essays. Okay. So, where should you disclose it? Typically in the additional information section, this is the best place to disclose the learning difference. So you want to describe the diagnosis, how this impacted the learning, and how they're doing well despite the challenges, how they've been adaptive or persistent, or driven. And then describe how working through the learning difference helped them grow, what accommodations they use to support them, and then end with positivity. So the student will always have to navigate a learning difficulty, but their learning difference will never stand in the way of learning, growing, being successful, etc. And there's a connection. If there's a connection between lower grades and the learning difference, it's okay to acknowledge it, but we don't want it to come across as like an excuse. So like, when I was learning to navigate this, I, struggled a little bit in school, but now I've made these changes and I'm heading in this direction. Okay, so all of those things can be great when you're using the additional information section. Okay, so starting the conversation about the college admissions process, self-advocacy, oh my gosh, self-advocacy is so incredibly important. I talk to students every day who know they have an IEP, but are unsure what their IEP covers. So they're not sure what their accommodations are. And this is the same for 504s. Students may not know exactly what's covered in their IEP. So um, if you haven't done so already, it may be a great time to sit down with your student and go over a copy of their IEP with them. And if you don't have a copy, you can request that from the school, from the special education department, and talk about what accommodations they have and talk about if those accommodations are actually helpful or not. So one of the things that I talk to students about, I have students with, ADHD. Oftentimes students with ADHD are given time and a half, are given additional time because there's kind of like this time blindness that can sometimes happen with ADHD. But when I talk to my students with ADHD, sometimes they say that's actually troublesome, like that accommodation actually isn't helpful for them because they find the deadline to be highly motivating. So knowing that the deadline can move or change makes it less likely that they'll get their work done. So talk to students about what accommodations they have and what's actually working for them versus what's not working for them. Have those conversations now, because when they go to college, they're going to have to advocate for themselves and do that on their own and explain what accommodations they're looking for and what is actually going to help them. Um, so the other piece of this is um, reaching out to the Office of Disabilities Services as quickly as possible, even if the learning difference is not disclosed on the application. And then also, like I said, talking to professors, even if it's not something that's typically covered necessarily, talking to your professor and letting them know what sort of accommodations you've had in the past that have been helpful. Many professors are kind and will try to work within those same things. Okay, so levels of support that are available in college. So some students are eligible for extra time on test or projects, priority registration. So when students are registering for class, some students may get priority registration and be able to register typically with the athletes. I think they go in that first block of students who register. Sign language interpreters, alternate testing environment with individual proctoring, use of calculators during exams, permission to take audio recordings in class, copies of notes, access to audiobooks, voice recognition, and text to speech programs, option to attend workshops on time management or study skills. And then some offices also have tutors available, and then housing accommodations can also be some of the things that are offered. But I always tell students, even if it's like not on this list, if you have an accommodation that works for you, advocate for yourself, try to get it, see what happens. The worst they can say is no. Okay. So there are also separate programs that can be included in the weekly schedule or daily meetings with a counselor. And there are some schools who have really fantastic programs, really fantastic support for their students. And these things are included, trying to help with, like I said, that somewhat difficult transition, making sure students are developing those soft skills along with the academic knowledge that they're gaining in college to be truly successful. Extra tutoring support, access to math or writing labs, priority registration, support with study skills, executive function, social skills, stress and time management, additional assistive technology, um, support groups, or reduced course requirements. So sometimes what we typically see is that some students may sometimes be able to graduate without like a foreign language requirement, depending on what learning difference they have. There are some things that they may be able to take off, but for the most part, they're going to complete the same program. Okay. So there are some schools that offer your higher levels of support. And if it's a specific program or a specific kind of school within the school, students may need to apply for the school and program separately. And they may include some extra essays. And these programs can support students in mainstream classes and or classes exclusively for students with learning differences. There are also schools that focus entirely on students that think and learn differently. And the success rate of students in these programs is very, very high. So, if you're someone who's kind of on the fence, I would say this is why school selection and school lists are so important. Choosing the right schools is so important because choosing the right environment can have a huge impact on the student's success. So maybe potentially going into one of these programs or going to a school that's specifically designed for students with learning differences can really, make or break the college experience. And some schools offer transitional summer programs, and these can be very helpful for some students. So like I said, that first year is typically kind of make or break. So allowing students to come to that summer program early gives them typically an additional 2 or 3 months to kind of get used to the system, get used to how things are working, take small class or small number of classes or small hours of classes, and kind of get it used to everything that's happening before college is fully starting. So I really, really recommend summer programs for students just to have that extra time to transition. So building a balanced college list, like we've said, this is incredibly important. Um, Having students research schools, email, calling schools with questions, and feeling heard. So reaching out to the services that the school has, asking kind of about what's going on. This can be very empowering for students and make them feel very comfortable when they're going to college if they've done this research and kind of know what to expect and have already talked to someone in the office who can tell them like, oh yeah, I remember your emails, we've talked about this. That can help with that level of comfort. For some students, they also choose to do community college for 2 years before transitioning to a four-year university, just because sometimes it's easier to stay closer to home. It's easier to be able to take classes, you know, part-time classes or full-time classes. Sometimes this can just feel like a smoother transition into a four-year university. Um, and it's important for the student to understand the school's flexibility, graduation requirements, services provided and offered, and if they have the option to substitute certain classes, both in a major and for graduation requirements. So understanding all of that going in, and what sort of pieces are flexible and what sort of pieces are not flexible. Okay, so talking to schools, students can be involved in the process by getting the answers to questions like what kind of student does well with the services that are offered, who is the contact person for the service, can students with LDs skip foreign language requirements, how do you show eligibility for services, are there tutors for students, do you have learning labs, do you have assistive technology? So kind of understanding everything the school offers and what's going to be of the most benefit to them. Okay. And once you're enrolled in school, start early to get services. So as soon as you've said, this is my school, I'm going here, you need to register with the DS office as soon as you can, and start the process early because they're going to want that documentation. They're going to want to process everything. They're going to want to figure out what accommodations are best. And like I said, make sure documentation is less than 3 years old. So junior year is a great time to get those ducks in a row. Documentation of an IEP or a 504, neuropsych report, a psychoeducational report is usually sufficient, but each school has their own requirements. So this is why as soon as you've said yes, as soon as you've confirmed your spot, start this process. And highly involve your student in this process. Like I said, it's going to make them feel more comfortable advocating for themselves and getting the proper accommodations. Okay. So, important things to remember, learning differences don't have anything to do with intelligence, motivation, desire to succeed, or ability to succeed. They can definitely make things more challenging, but they aren't impacting those areas. It's not a deficit, it's a difference in how we think. And learning different students can be just as successful in college, careers, and life as those without learning differences. And just as capable of achieving their goals and plans for the future. Sometimes it's just like having a little extra support makes all the difference. Okay. So we'd like to open it up for, some questions, see what we can answer for you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Taylor. We have a couple of questions. I'm going to pull them up. And just as a reminder, at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A box. So you can add your questions there and I will read those aloud. All right. So one of the questions is, can IEP accommodations be extended into college?
So yes and no. So it depends on the accommodation. So it's not going to be an IEP. It's going to be covered under that 504. But let's say something like extended time on projects that require a significant amount of reading for a student with dyslexia. That is typically an accommodation that a university would be willing to consider and make for the student. However, it's not going to be the same as their IEP, so it's under a different umbrella. And so this is like why you want to start that conversation early. And it's like I said, it's about access to the information. It's not necessarily about the student success. So IEPs are very much about what we can do to make the student successful. 504s are just about access. So how do I give you access to the same information, not how do I necessarily make it equitable for you to do the same work? Is that a good explanation? Okay.
Great. On that note, there's another question here. I don't know. I think it was answered in the presentation, but how does it work to have a 504 documentation on file? There was never a diagnosis of anything specific and
Mhm.
just accommodation of group counseling and extra time since second grade, never a neuropsych evaluation or anything.
So the 504 is still going to be valid. So there's still an understanding that the student needed an accommodation. So there doesn't necessarily have to be a specific diagnosis for a school to make an accommodation, for a university to make an accommodation, as long as there's documentation of what that accommodation is and that it's been successful in the student or successful for the student. For most universities, that's going to be sufficient.
Okay, great. Thanks, Taylor. There's another question here. It says, disclosing an LD helpful for a student to be admitted into a difficult school or major?
I would say if it's providing context, if it's providing context for like why the student made certain choices, right? Then yes, that could be beneficial. But as far as like, is this going to make the student a more desirable candidate? I don't think that it's going to have that impact. It's just basically providing some context for like why certain things may look a certain way on the application. Like we said, if they're taking certain courses or opted out of certain courses, it can provide context to, flesh out the profile, but it's not going to, give the student kind of like a plus one for diversity.
Yeah. Got it. Great. The next question says, are there scholarships or financial support resources for students with learning differences? If
Yes.
so, and if
Sorry.
how do we find these?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there definitely are scholarships and there is financial support for students with learning differences. And so sometimes this is accessible through the general application to the school. Sometimes you can find like if it's not necessarily through the merit, but certain schools will have certain scholarships available for students. But then there are other programs that are outside of schools that are like individual programs that offer support for this. And this would be dependent on where you live and some other, profile information, but we can definitely help you look for those things.
Okay, great. Thank you. There is another question asking, are you familiar with the OASIS program at Pace University? And if so, do you apply after you are accepted?
So for Oasis, I believe you do apply. Hang on, I have to like think back. It's been a while since I've done an Oasis application. But yes, I do really like the Oasis. I do want to say I really do like Oasis's program. They have been really supportive with students that I've had who have gone there, and those students have felt very supported. So I do just want to like shout them out if that's a school you're considering. Um, but I believe that after you are accepted, you then apply for the Oasis program, and it should be there's an option to select it in the application, and then you finish the application once you've been accepted, if that makes sense. So, like, you check a box like, yes, I'm interested in this, then you get accepted, and then you finish the application.
Okay, great. And then the next question says, is there specialized support a student with an expressive language difference seek when writing? Sorry, I'm trying to, I think it's supposed to say, is there specialized support for a student with an expressive language difference when writing college essays?
Mm. So there should be accommodations. I would think that there's a couple of ways that you could approach this. So my first question would be like, what accommodation is the student getting in high school? And then I would say like, how has that been successful? So for some students, that means that they have the opportunity, if it's like a writing difficulty, they may have the opportunity to use the writing center and have someone from that writing center to type as they're speaking. That's an accommodation that I've seen before. And then typically those recessions are recorded. There's like some parameters in there to make sure that no one is cheating. Um, but then there's also assistive technology. Assistive technology has come a really long way. And so sometimes that can also be the accommodation. But I would say whatever accommodation they've had in high school, that would be something to bring up with the DS office and see if that can be extended into college. But yeah, there are several accommodations.
Okay, great. I have another question here that says, what are some ways for my student to stand out?
Mm. So typically, there's a few different things. One is that students are doing the things that they're passionate about in high school. I think that's like the number one thing that helps students stand out, like real, true passion, real, true engagement. Admissions counselors are reading tons of applications. It becomes pretty obvious who's like really dug in and really like loving what they're doing. That's like a great way to stand out. Um, but as far as like a learning difference, like I said, that can be through explaining how the learning difference affected them, in that additional information section. That can be really important to give context. But really just like having students do the things that they're passionate about and try to do them at like the highest level possible for that student, that makes a really big difference.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I just want
Uh,
to say something quickly,
yeah,
just to confirm what Taylor said. For the OASIS program, it's just a, are you interested on the application? And then after they get accepted, they can apply.
great. Thank you. The next question asks, are there particular types of schools that value neurodiversity more than others?
Yes, there definitely are. Um, so even if your student doesn't want to use one of the like a program like Oasis. So let's say even if a student doesn't want to use a program like Oasis at Pace, schools that have those programs typically celebrate learning differences. They celebrate neurodiversity. They have a population of students who go to those schools for those programs. So that means that typically their professors are more aware of those differences and are more likely to work with students. It means that the students that they're going to be like interacting with in class also probably have learning differences, and so they're more likely to kind of like find a group of people that they connect with and have faced similar struggles in their educational journey. So typically any university that has a specialized program for learning differences, even if you're not interested in applying specifically to that program, is going to be a good bet because it means that they've put time and effort and energy into thinking through what students with learning differences need. And for a lot of students, that in itself can make a huge difference.
Great. Thank you. The next question says, when I talk to schools, all they will say is that they have support for kids with LDs, but don't give much more information. They say they will give more information after acceptance, but how do I know what is a good college to support kids with LDs and know where it's best to apply in the first place?
Okay, yeah. So that for me, if a school says like, yes, we have support, but it's not giving you specific information on what support they offer, that's a red flag for me. I would be hesitant to put my child, my student in that situation. They should be able to say, here's our DS office. And here are the things that they offer. And here are some of the like accommodations we've had for students with similar diagnosis or similar issues in the past. They should be able to provide that information for you. It's one thing to get like an email back that's like, hey, I'm not sure, let me redirect you to these people who are going to have more information. That's totally fine. But this idea of like, once you apply, we'll figure that out, that's
Mhm.
not great because you need support. You're going to need support, and they should be able to explain what types of support they offer. um, so like I said, schools that have specific programs for learning differences, that's always great for me. The other thing I would say is, if you have a list of schools that you're interested in, like you've already kind of got your preliminary list going, go ahead and start like just on their website looking at what their DS office looks like. And send them an email. Hey, we're considering applying. Can you tell me a little bit more about what services you offer? And someone from that office should be able to give you a pretty good rundown, or at least point you in the right direction of where you can find more information. And if they're not doing that and they can't do that, for me, that's a no go.
Yeah, I would also say if you're going to like visit a school, definitely try to meet with someone from those offices, so that you can really just, talk about what you need and see if they can provide it.
Great. The next question says, does Boston College offer resources and accommodations for students with disabilities?
They do. They don't have like a dedicated program that I'm aware of, unless they've changed it in the last year. But they do offer accommodations. Their DS office is typically pretty supportive, and it does seem like they work with students more on like an individual level. And I mean, all schools are working with students on an individual level, but some schools do provide like some group support and some group opportunities. But from Boston College, it seems like, okay, we're going to meet with you, we're going to go through your paperwork, and we're going to offer you like the accommodations that you're requesting or like that you're eligible for. But I haven't heard a lot of stories from students who go to Boston College about getting kind of, like I said, those professor accommodations or getting support in that way. So that might be something to consider.
Okay, great. The next question says, I'd like to understand whether students with IEPs or 504 plans experience any disadvantages during the college admissions process, particularly at selective universities.
Mhm.
Could you also share which top universities are recognized for offering strong academic and accessibility support for your students with learning differences or disabilities?
So the first part of this question, I'm sorry, could you repeat the first part of this question?
Two-parter.
Sorry.
I'd like to understand whether students with IEPs or 504 plans experience any disadvantages
Hmm,
in the college admissions process, particularly at selective universities.
okay. So typically it I think like I said, the context is really important. So like when you're disclosing things about the IEP or the 504 and providing context for why the student has chosen the courses that they've chosen, or why the student has opted in or opted out of certain things, I think that can give students sometimes like a little bit more leeway, especially with things like rigor. So like for some schools, if your school offers like, 20 AP courses and the student took five, and that's kind of giving some context of why they took five courses instead of 18 or 19, that I think can be beneficial. But and like I said, it's not something that you want, like you don't want the identity to be the learning difference in the application. You want the student to stand on their own. This is a part of what's happened in my educational story, but this is not who I am as a person, and this does not define me as a scholar, right? This is just like a piece of my puzzle. Um, and then thinking about
Can
trying
I
to
say
think.
something while you're
Yeah,
thinking?
yeah, please, please, please.
I was just gonna say, like, the only reason I could think of it hurting them is if they disclose that they need something that the college can't offer, which
Mhm.
obviously
Yeah.
means that that college is not a good fit for them. But that to me would be the only thing that would make it a negative to a college. Like, first of all, most people don't even disclose, but if you do disclose because you're trying to explain something, again, you're doing it because as a positive, like I'm explaining something, giving you context. But just, if you get some type of accommodation that is not going to be offered at most schools, maybe that's not, something to talk about, or maybe figure out first if they offer it before you apply.
Yeah. Yeah. So then definitely like reaching out, finding out what they offer, and then deciding to disclose or not disclose based on that could definitely be important. Um, I'm gonna just a lot of top 20 schools or top 25 schools, they're offering those like accommodations, but they don't necessarily have specialized programs. Like that's just how it is. And part of it is because they're so competitive, they don't have to, which is unfortunate and kind of sad in the state of education that we are today. Like that, top 25 schools should be offering some of those programs. Northeastern has some great options. DePaul has some great options. SMU has some great options. Pace University has some great options. So these are some of the schools that come to mind when I've had students with learning differences where they really were looking for that support. These are some of the schools that they were very interested in.
Okay, great. And then there's more of a comment here saying, as a college professor, I get students with accommodations sometimes. Often it's extra time for assignments. A university office informs me, and usually the student does also. It's a routine thing. As a parent, it underlines importance of making sure my daughter has access to some support in college. So
Yeah,
just
absolutely. Yeah, it's so important to get those accommodated, and especially like I always ask students when we're kind of going through this process, what are the things that take you the longest? Is it reading? Is it the essay writing? Like, what are the things that when you sit down, you think are going to take you an hour or two and end up taking you 5? And then that's kind of where we need to figure out like what accommodations can shorten that time or where we can ask for a time extension, um, because understanding how to use your time is a skill, and in college it's a completely different skill than in high school because you get those assignments in class, your homework is pretty planned out for you, and in college there is kind of more ambiguity about what's happening, and how to get things done and when to get things done, and so a lot of students struggle with that in the beginning. So time accommodations can be really important, and helping students understand how to manage their time is crucial.
perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Taylor. That is all the questions that we have tonight. Thank you, Deb and Beacon, for granting us this opportunity to share this information. If at any
Absolutely.
point, we appreciate it. And if at any point, there are any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And we can also direct those questions to Taylor. And the email on the screen is contact@gecollegeprep.com. And as you can also see, we're happy to provide a free 30-minute one-on-one consultation as well. So
Thank you
thank,
guys so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
thanks so
Have a
much.
great night.
Thank
Night.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.